All right, I'd like to thank Craig LeClaire for providing the opening keynote of the Automation Summit. And I'm going to kick off the 2 days worth of head-centric content here for the Automation Summit. So I'm Dustin Grimeisen. I head up our specialty organization, the specialty engineers who do a lot of consulting around data center and networking and security and a lot of the aspects that you'll hear about over the next few days with the automation capabilities within those different groups, extending from data center to, out to the cloud. And the title of my presentation is really, I call it Automation Fundamentals Back to the Basics, but it's really not so much the technical basics of automation. It's getting us back down to the fundamental basics of building an automation program and some of the pitfalls that happen when we see our clients going down this journey. And so hopefully this can kind of tee us up for some of those ideas around building the program, looking for the quick wins, and making automation a success within your organization. I have a few examples as well that I'll go over that at a very high level, and then throughout the next 2 days you'll see a lot deeper dive on some of the topics that I bring up here. So to start with, I'll talk about what we call the digital business imperatives. Here at AHEAD, we start a lot of conversations this way where it's really not about product or process or procedure. It's more about our clients want innovation, right? They want to differentiate themselves with technology. They want to be faster, more efficient, more agile. And as I kind of tee this up, you'll see in a lot of areas that automation plays a fundamental piece in achieving these digital business imperatives. It's looking at that business goal and then utilizing technology to get there and eliminating some of those gaps in the things that cause us to be less efficient, cause us to be slower. And so automation is a critical component to that. If I drill in deeper to how the multiple fronts that are part of digital transformation, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to make work less tedious, more streamlined. We're trying to open up about performance and understand what is actually going on in the environment, provide that transparency, that visibility into the environment, into the ins and outs. We are trying to take our teams from being sort of siloed technology approach to more collaborative, more efficient, building towards that business outcome versus individual pieces and parts and components. And then from a security perspective, security really plays a big part in digital transformation because we need security to be embedded into the function. I talk about this a lot with my network teams that networks aren't designed today with security as sort of this other function. The security functions are embedded into the network. And to do that, you have to be able to automate a lot of that. You have to be able to automate network configuration, security configuration. So again, security plays a part in this digital transformation. And then we really want to build dynamic technology stacks so we can pivot and move more quickly, eliminate that technical debt that everyone knows exists out there. And if I drill in a little bit deeper, just using these examples, and you may see some version of these slides throughout the next 2 days, is we're really helping our clients build more modernized applications. And not to go into the real deep details here on this slide, you'll hear more about these kind of things over the next few days, but notice how much of building this process towards sort of the solutions to outcomes that are business-related outcomes, the technology in between, how much is about automation, taking microservices and stitching them together, automating provisioning, automating the deployment process, automating the things like testing, right? So automation as part of a modernized application development platform is very important. Or if I take a look at, say, operations, we call it intelligent operations, but it's not just having eyes on glass to manage, the uptime of environment or maybe security eyes on glass, human intervention. It's also adding the automation component, being able to see trends, being able to filter through multiple alerts and eliminate alert fatigue. Automation of these components is very critical to achieving that sort of intelligent operations that we talk about. And so kind of wrapping up the benefits here that I think a lot of people know is, what can automation deliver in that context of digital transformation? Well, one thing from a people perspective, we can reallocate our workers to higher value work, or just eliminate some of that, the tedious work, right, that we talked about. The two middle bullets really go together, honestly. Reducing that error, lowering the risk, especially in the security standpoint, right? I can't tell you how many times a security incident is created because of a misconfiguration. If that configuration was standardized and automated, we would have reduced the likelihood that that problem would have occurred, right? And then in general, I think everyone knows we want to be able to work faster or more efficiently. More agile is another way to put it, right? So this is what automation can deliver for us, but I would kind of stop and say, well, what's holding us back? Because we know that all of us out there in all of our environments, we're not all the way to that goal, right? We still have things in our environments that aren't working the most efficient way. In some cases, we're very mature in automation. In other cases, we're still at the very surface level, having a hard time, getting over that hump. And so some of the things that hold our clients back from our perspective, if I look at what's broken today, a lot of it can really be boiled down to environments that are too complex, not standardized. Tools and teams that, again, are saying too complex, not standardized, too much sprawl. In general sense, there's not a well-defined strategy that includes the business element, right, of what is the actual technological outcome that we're trying to achieve here. The strategies often stop at the infrastructure layer or stop at the application layer, and so it's very hard to build that well-defined process and that consistent process when you have all these different pieces and parts doing their own things. And then from an automation perspective, we're still very task-centric in IT. We have not focused on what that ultimate automated outcome would be, or just what the ultimate business outcome would be, so that we can identify those automation opportunities along the way. And another way to kind of talk about that is, when I go back to those digital business imperatives, what are some of the things that are keeping our clients, some of our clients, from being able to modernize? I still think that most people look at IT department is slow, too much manual process, they're too inflexible with their options. There's a lot of cost overrun due to waste in the environment, those kind of things. And there's a general view that IT is difficult to work with. And it's hard to tell underneath the covers of what the IT teams are working on, because, again, they're not presenting back to the business an outcome per se. They are executing functions underneath. And so, a lot of what we talked about with the siloed teams, that leads to these kind of inefficiencies and problems, and why we haven't necessarily transformed as much as we could. And every business is tackling some of these things, and some are doing better than others, but it's still really a situation that's out there that we have to continue to have an impact on. And I think for us, and when we look down into the IT layer, we can more simply show this picture that says, we're still doing too much of this. Requests come in, right? We're requests reactive based, and then you have the siloed teams that process the various parts of the request. And I'll talk a little bit later when I go over infrastructure automation, how, as the data is passing forth, or the request is passing back and forth between these different teams, that's actually the slowest part of the process. Most of the times when we analyze IT environments and IT process, the queue time is the largest part of the effort. Each individual team is usually moving pretty efficiently and pretty quickly within themselves, but they have not linked it together yet into a holistic strategy. So some of the things that you'll hear from us over the next 2 days, I call it enterprise automation here, but sometimes you'll hear us say things like enterprise cloud, to address these challenges that a lot of clients face to sort of digital transformation. We want to eliminate manual steps, or at least work on that manual handoff part. There might still be human actions that have to happen underneath, but when those actions are completed and it needs to go into the next phase, can at least that handoff be automated so that the work is more efficient and you're not waiting for some human to pick it up? We want to make things more reliable. I used the security network example before. As things are standardized, they get inherently less complex. And so automation can be built upon them to make the processes themselves standardized and eliminate the error factor. eliminate the fact that, again, most outages and security incidents are at some point caused by a human mistake. And so we want to make our processes more reliable via automation. I think it's obvious that we want to reduce time to market. We want to be faster and more efficient. Visibility, I touched on. We want to have systems that we know more of what's going on. And again, this goes back to that eliminating the complexity, eliminating the sprawl of tools and teams, because you really want to see true performance in an environment. How's an application performing end-to-end, or a business service performing end-to-end, and which pieces and parts can be improved over time? We need that visibility, and so we need some of this standardization to do that. And then ultimately, hopefully, the goal is to drive satisfaction, either for our customers or for our internal consumers of our services. And so we kind of have a simplistic approach. I've even simplified it a little further for the purpose of this conversation. But when it comes to automation and how that has an impact on digital transformation, we simply say establish a vision. Decide what automation is going to look like for your organization. In some companies, that's going to be very complex and like a lot of really fine-tuned outcomes. In some, it's just we want to achieve efficiencies within the organization. You have to decide what it means to you and set that vision. Not set the steps just yet, just set the vision of where you want to get. And then secondarily, map requests and workflows. So figure out what those most common requests are that come in, especially if you're taking an IT-centric view of automation, is determine what the most common requests are. Don't set the ultimate goals based on, maybe over the next 2 days, you'll see us lay out an automation framework of a particular type. You'll actually see a few from me today, but don't set your goals in that space based on what I showed you as was an outcome for another client in a particular scenario. Your goals have to align with how much time and effort you want to put into it and how much benefits towards digital transformation it's going to give you. And then once you're able to do that, you can accelerate automation. And I talk about integration across silos later on, but there are things that you can do to get your automation journey off the ground much more quickly, and you're not wasting effort, right? You're not doing something that doesn't improve down the line, and I'll talk about that in a little bit later. And just to kind of pile on there are a couple of approaches, or there are a couple of different types of things that you can do when you're working towards this automation framework. Some of them are going to be strategic, long-term things that you're going to do, building around your automation program. Some of them are tactical, right? Maybe it's automation capabilities within one of the silos. But ultimately what happens is you have strategic and tactical feeds. You want to get those wins. And a lot of times the early wins are more tactical. But over time, you build upon, and what we call cloud, or that, that automation framework, where you slowly start to align your processes with the business outcomes and achieve those digital business imperatives that I talked about earlier. Craig mentioned in his presentation about layers of abstraction, and sometimes that's what it comes down to, is taking these concepts and putting abstractions over them. You may not necessarily have the stitching between different services just yet, but if you can abstract services so that all you see is the outcome of that microservice or whatever it may be, then you can start to piece them together, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. Before I go into my examples, just talking about some areas of automation, and you'll hear about quite a few of these things over the next 2 days during the Automation Summit. I think a lot of people focus early attempts at automation around provisioning, deploying virtual machines, automating the deployment of applications, working with networks and things like that, infrastructure layer items, or simply accounts, which is one of my examples, is about access management automation. And those things are very important. I think as you move along the maturity perspective, then you start to get into maybe more day 2 type operations and maintenance. How do we automate the response to incidents in the environment, or how do we automate the response to security alerts and incidents that come in? How do we automatically scale our infrastructures or the applications to meet demand and scale back when demand is lower? I think these things take it to a next level. And you can get there by doing sort of the basic provisioning things first and improving in that area, and then slowly sort of stitching these things together such that you get that better visibility, that better operational control. And then I think fully at the maturity level is kind of going out to that service management layer. So, I can automatically provision, I can do automated, modifications, or I can, automatically respond to incidents. But now how do I wrap my business change control and my reporting functions into that and get that better consistency and reliability that we're looking for? And so these are some of the areas of automation that you'll hear about over the next few days. To kind of wrap up this entry-level presentation, I'm going to go through just a couple of examples and kind of talk about how to get from a basic use case down to a more mature automated environment. And so the first example that I'm going to start with is around user access management, sort of the onboarding, offboarding, modification of users in an environment. And I think this is one of those that goes overlooked sometimes, but it's a big problem as our companies get more complex. You add more employees, or maybe you go through a lot of merger acquisition type activities. It gets to be very difficult not just to onboard a user and get them into the company, or a contractor, let's say. It doesn't have to just be an employee. But how is the assignment done? How do we create accounts? And now this sort of multi-cloud world, how do we create accounts in every different area? How do we assign the appropriate permissions? A lot of times, I would say those are manual tasks. In a lot of our clients, we've seen that the most basic form of automation is there's a form that gets filled out and there's some approval flow. Most places are there, but actually provisioning accounts to the right places and making sure the security is there, it can be complicated if you don't have a strategy around it. Also talk about modification in this scenario. So a user moves departments, or they need access changed for whatever reason. Think about all the manual steps that happen in that process, from the request to somebody's approval to somebody actually going and changing the permissions and attributes. And I can tell you that most of the time the onboarding and sort of the adds and changes happen, but removals don't happen very often. So, I don't mention it here really around the updates, but that sort of continuous visibility around what is being accessed and what is being used, and moving more towards a least privilege type model. All of these things would require some level of automation to make them efficient, or you're just piling on more manual tasks to slow this down even further. And so what we end up with today is, a lot of processes associated with onboarding, offboarding, and changes. These are very common IT requests, and they can really bog down IT environments with just the simply permissions type requests for internal users. There are efforts within organizations to, again, automate some of these, right? Maybe it's a form that you fill out and maybe you match somebody's security. But the security frameworks are getting more tight on that as well, about being able to give the least privilege, only give the permissions to access data that specifically that user needs, and continuously audit that information and keep it down over time. And so as the security requirements get more, these manual tasks are going to get harder, and thus slow things down even more, right? So security, vulnerability, and just speed and efficiency is at risk. And so kind of going back to my establish a vision and map the workflows, from an access management perspective, our recommendation is to determine what those requirements are. And don't think about the end state of, if I had a fully automated identity and access management platform with governance and all that. You just need to think about the most basic tasks, the ones that happen the most often, and develop a plan to do onboarding, offboarding, and change. And then as you get more mature, as you kind of handle those provisioning and change tasks, then you can move into day 2 and operations and visibility, then move into sort of the governance. But you don't want to have that ultimate big picture view slow you down from getting those quick wins over time. And what could an automated access management platform look like? This is a picture of an environment that would be similar to one that Ahead has built for customers. One thing I mentioned on the last slide too was, a lot of times this particular piece of automation can be done with existing tools. But if new tools have to be brought in, they should be brought in with that automation in mind. And I'll use this example here to kind of tell why that is. If you look at a lot of the things that have to be touched when it comes to, access management, identity and access management automation, it's so many different sources of truth, whether it be Active Directory or HR systems or sales, CRMs, and so many different places where access has to be provisioned. May it be cloud applications or private environments. And so in this particular case, it can be very complex to try to build automation between all of those. And so this is a case where if you didn't have something existing, I would recommend sort of a centralized identity platform. In this example here, we used Okta, and we use ServiceNow as the ITSM layer. And so Okta becomes sort of your new single source of truth, and it has API calls out to the various sources of truth and applications to be able to do the provisioning, and then ServiceNow is that ITSM layer to kind of handle the process flow and the coordination between that. But you don't get to this state with a fully automated ServiceNow and Okta integration in all applications and all sources of truth day one. You're generally going to start with the basic use cases, again, onboard, offboard, most common tasks, and develop over time. And I would say the final level of maturity is being able to sort of report and audit on that access and regularly prune it, which is important in a security conversation. But if the goal to build the automation plan around identity is to get there first, I think you'll run into a lot of problems by not doing those sort of in-between steps that I talked about. So that's another good example, around security and identity and access. And I will go through now basic infrastructure as a service. I think infrastructure as a service is something that a lot of us have either done or considering doing or are in the process of doing. It's one of the most basic automation examples that a lot of people think about. But I still see a lot of organizations that struggle to get IaaS off the ground. And I think part of the problem is we're still doing too many manual tasks. And this is kind of another way to look at this, but as a request comes in, there is a lot of time spent in queue waiting for a different silo to perform their function. And so we're still really kind of passing paper back and forth between each other. And even if we think about automation as just, I want to automate the spin up of a virtual machine or something like that, that is definitely a great achievement, but we haven't quite linked those things together just yet in a lot of cases. But I would say that the individual silo execution is still very important to the long run goal. So kind of taking this sort of foundational to more mature approach, trying to get those quick wins. I think in the infrastructure as a service example, quick wins could be the individual silos improving, the situation in their service, right? So if I'm an infrastructure layer, things like automated VM provisioning, or in networking, things like automated load balancers or DNS, improving within the group at least makes it to where when that task hits that silo, that part is consistent, is reliable and fast. And then over time, what you can do is you can stitch those together between the different silos and create that optimization. But again, if you start with the sort of the fully stitched visionary offering, and you haven't thought about how to improve the steps in between, you might be getting yourself behind because you're thinking a maturity a level that's too far ahead. So we generally would say, optimize within the silos and then stitch the silos together. And then what can happen is as each of the different silos of the business or the IT start to build their microservices, then what we can do is we're ready to move to that next level of maturity is kind of piece the services together into blueprints. And this is sort of that first phase of sort of getting an infrastructure catalog built up, is to take those, siloed automations between compute, network, storage in this example, or maybe security as another example, move them together into a blueprint, and then publish that blueprint into a catalog. And now you have a win, right? Here is a particular service that's very common. It involves multiple steps in the process, and now we can deploy it from a catalog. And you've standardized that service now so that every time that request is made, it's done the same way. You start to eliminate sort of that complexity that's part of this. And then you can tackle the next one, right? You can go to the next workflow and improve within the silos and then stitch those together into a blueprint and continuously iterate on the environment, create those layers of abstraction, and then abstract on top of those layers. So thinking about it in an application development sense, the final application you see happen because of many different layers of improvements over time, and that's kind of what we're getting at here with the foundations. And so what you could end up with is, as you develop, then the portal, we'll start to show you some of our examples over the next few days with our automation hub and some of the other things that we've developed. But you start to get to where requests can come through an automation portal, and now you start to link together. That request might provision the right, virtual machines. It might, do the networking components, IP address management, domain name, DNS management. Things like Active Directory or other security services might to get layered in there. They may not be in the first iteration of the blueprint, but as long as you're using this approach, you can start to layer these other services into the blueprint over time and make things more consistent. And so that's one way to look at it, is taking all of these and building that blueprint and then sort of having that cloud provisioning approach. And I think the most mature way is then building that ITSM capability around it. And I'll kind of end here with a look at, this is a reference architecture that we've built for customers. In this particular case, using ServiceNow and vRealize Orchestrator. It could be, another cloud platform, maybe a public cloud platform. But this is linking together from, ITSM, the request, the change management, down through infrastructure, down through applications, and, sort of that continuous configuration management. You're not going to get here in day one. Right? You're going to take the approach that I've talked about over the presentation. You're going to build on those foundational layers, and then ultimately you will get to some semblance of this, whatever makes the most sense in your environment. It could be different infrastructure layers. It could be different service management layers. But I think if I had to wrap up, my point entirely, is that you want to set that vision for where you want to be, but then you also want to map out those tasks that get you there and get those wins and achieve them over time. And then as things develop, as things layer abstractions on top of each other, you can get to an automated access management use case, or maybe an automated provisioning architecture, or maybe a modern application development pipeline, as I showed earlier in the presentation. So to wrap up here, again, just to kind of reiterate the approach: establish that vision, map requests and workflows, and then accelerate automation. Don't wait for the big final outcome. You have that vision and you have the steps defined and you have the program built so that you can be consistent about it. You can start to get those quick wins within the silos, but then the real benefits start to come in when you stitch those together into blueprints and services, ultimately, that you continuously iterate and improve over time to match the needs of the business. So thank you for joining me for this session, and we will now go over to a round of Q&A. So if there's any questions out there about this, I'm happy to answer them.
All right, taking a look at the Q&A here. Couple good questions came in throughout the presentation. So the first one that I will address is the question says, in the identity automation example, do you recommend looking at products like Okta or SailPoint prior to implementing automation? I believe I used Okta as the example in that part of the presentation. I think that one comment that I made was, to utilize existing tools or to build for a purpose. And the point I make there is that a tool like an Okta or a SailPoint was also in the question, is very API friendly, right? Built for this purpose. All of the functionality is exposable in APIs. And I think that's one thing when you look through your tooling that has to be determined, is that there are certain existing tools that it can be very, very complex to automate on top of. And as you begin that journey, you have to determine, what's the ROI of trying to make that work versus implementing better tooling. And that actually kind of leads into another question that I got, which was in selecting third-party SaaS platforms, how do you ensure that the platforms are integration and automation ready? I really think, for me personally, it comes down to the existence of a well-documented API and how API-friendly the platform itself is. You saw a number of examples in this presentation, Okta being one, or even ServiceNow from a service management perspective, where they are built to be automated on. And I think that becomes pretty obvious when you dig into those solutions and see how friendly they are to APIs. So APIs, to me, are very critical to that. You need to be friendly to application development to be friendly to automation. Another question was, can you give some other examples of use cases that I would consider entry level? Actually thought about adding a third use case around network automation, cut it out due to time. Network automation, I think, is a one that comes up a lot because what we find is the vast majority of network outages are caused by a change going wrong. So network automation would fit into one of those of automating for consistency. And again, not necessarily seeing that final journey of microsegmentation and all of the what you could dream up in network automation, but simply that provisioning or change layer, being more consistent with that. And I would say network automation is another one that goes back to the first question around, tools and automation friendliness. Doing automation on a legacy multi-tier network with different, firewalls, routers, switches, without a software-defined network platform can be quite difficult because they're not API friendly. They don't necessarily speak the same languages, even within the same vendors. So that's another example of one of those where you might have to consider building your software-defined layer first before you can put heavy emphasis on automation features. Another question was, has the pandemic put a heavy challenge to getting some of these automation projects off the ground? Changes in infrastructure, work at home. I think Craig covered a little bit of this in his session. I would say in some ways the pandemic has definitely increased the challenge. Going back to that identity example, you now have users that can log in basically from anywhere, right? So it's not just about automating the access, but that actual access layer has changed on you, the nature of the way that people have logged in. But I would also say that presents an opportunity. That the sort of new way to work that I call it presents a big opportunity to implement the right tools, the right processes and procedures now, and take into account those more advanced use cases. So yes, it does make getting those off the ground harder because the nature of what it means to access systems has changed, but it also gives you the opportunity to make the changes as necessary. Another question here, how does one build a template with specific criteria to measure or pre-measure ROI for scaling automation initiatives? What tools are available to do this today? I won't answer that question in too much detail because there is actually a session tomorrow that I think is going to talk quite a bit about that. It's more of a panel discussion, but prioritizing your automation journey. And this can be one of the harder tasks to what I was talking about earlier when I said that you want to build a strategy and then go look for those wins. I think a lot of times we spend a lot of time trying to figure out that ROI, and the ROI, you really aren't going to be able to develop it. First off, there's no perfect tool that does this. But second, if you don't understand your service mapping and you don't understand the human and the non-human costs that go into that service process, it can be very difficult to calculate what those costs are and how do they impact whatever that ultimate business service is. What are the underlying component costs of that? What is the cost of waiting for a change or waiting for a provisioning? Those have to be determined, and it can be a challenging process and somewhat manual. We are doing that with a number of customers with tools like ServiceNow, although not specifically built for that, but the service mapping feature is something that you can do in ServiceNow, and start to map out your services as they exist. And then you can utilize that mapping to start kind of mapping out the costs underneath. And then ultimately, when you get started on your automation strategy, is there going to be a benefit in that service mapping from end to end by automating any of the individual components, not necessarily the whole thing, but you have to figure out if there's going to be a benefit to automating any of the individual components. Not an easy task and not a straightforward answer, but it's certainly something that everybody is trying to figure out. And I would just say it comes back to really accurately mapping out your services and what it takes to deliver them. Okay, looking through. So next question, we've been working for a while on automating IT processes and are trying to do more business automation. Can you suggest any sources of info that help us avoid some of the pitfalls of automating and suggested standards for business processes without creating a lot of risk to keep up with the changes to automations? This kind of goes back to a couple of the points that I was already making. You have to map out those services and understand what are those individual tasks and what is the time it takes in those tasks. You have to really understand, some people would say, is the juice worth the squeeze, right, to automate something? So in general sense, right, forgetting the technology that's underneath, you have to take a look at that more holistically and really understand the end-to-end process for a particular business process that you're trying to automate. Now, when it comes to the technology, sources of info on the pitfalls, you'll probably hear quite a bit of them over the next 2 days as we dig deeper into the specific types of automation. So stay tuned for that. I totally hear you on the risk to keeping up with changes in automations. And so when we talk about our enterprise cloud or our automation hub, some of that will show you how it's not just how you automate, but how did you standardize before you automated? Did you standardize on a platform? Did you standardize on software infrastructure that's API friendly? And you won't always get it right, but I think you have to take a look at what the infrastructure is that serves up this business process and evaluate each component individually. And some of them are absolutely, you will find, are not worth automating in their current form. They're still going to be a manual step there, and you want to at least automate the handoff, or you have to think about refreshing that technology to something that's more automation friendly. But you don't want to get yourself into where the work effort to automate is more, obviously, than the cycles it takes to perform the action. Next question is, can you elaborate on technology lifecycle management? Does Okta have a built-in database to report on end of life? Do you recommend any other tools? So I'll stick to specifically the Okta example here because that was in the question, or access management in general. Okta does have a built-in directory, right? So it's one of those identity tools that sort of sits outside of your other sources. When you look at identity tools, you might have some that just integrate with Active Directory or whatever other directory services that you have and just provide security services. Okta is an example of one that, tries to become the directory, the single source of truth over top. That's one big benefit to automation, right? Because you're talking to one platform. They do have tools around lifecycle and governance of user access. So, how long has this account been active? What is it actually accessing? Not just what does it have access to? There's a little bit of that there in Okta, but I will say that when you take that to the next level and you want to start automating governance, you're probably going to need something outside of just the access layer, an Okta or an Active Directory or whatever you're using for the access layer. And so some customers are using a governance tool like SailPoint to do more of that governance automation. In the example that I showed earlier, we utilized an integration between ServiceNow and Okta to do that. So Okta is the actual thing that gets it done, the directory that you are implementing change in, but there was a layer outside of it to manage the process and the governance. So Okta has the directory, which is great. It doesn't necessarily have all of the features that you need from a lifecycle governance perspective. They're developing, but in many cases, you're going to need something outside of that. Okay, I think there's quite a bit more in here, and I'm going to try to answer some of these offline. Let me make sure I get to a few that kind of tie in. Yeah, I think the rest of them I'll probably answer offline. There's quite a bit of questions in here that I think are better for a one-on-one answer. But so I'll wrap it up there for the live Q&A. I appreciate everybody joining my session. I appreciate the great questions. I will try to get to all of you after this. And I believe we're going to take a little bit of a break right now and come back after lunch with network automation is the first session. So it's something that's come up quite a bit in my conversation here. And my colleague Ryan Alt is going to dive much deeper on that with network automation specifically, and I believe security automation in the afternoon session. So a lot more to come over the next couple of days. I appreciate you joining my session today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.